Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, in this lecture, the first of a two-part lecture on the English colonies in the 18th century, we're going to discuss how the English colonies transitioned into the 18th century, go over some new developments in the early and mid 18th century, and also we're going to learn about some of the English colonies that we haven't discussed yet, starting with New York. Now, New York was not originally called New York. In fact, it was not even settled by the English originally. It was settled by Dutch people from the Netherlands. And so when those Dutch settlers first began settling up and down the Hudson River in 1624, they called their colony New Netherland. And the capital of New Netherland was named after the largest city in the Netherlands. It was called New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam came about because of possibly the greatest land deal in the history of the human race. Peter Minuit, the Dutch governor of New Netherland, approached the Indians who lived on Manhattan Island and bought Manhattan from those Indians for some glass beads and a few trinkets that were probably worth a few $100s in today's money, and in return he got the richest piece of real estate in the world, which is probably worth trillions of dollars today. But originally New Amsterdam was just a small village on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, where Battery Park is today in New York City. And then, just like now, New Amsterdam, today's New York City, was a tremendously diverse place with people from many different countries, from many different parts of the world, and also many different religions were represented there, including Catholics and Jews. Both groups were not welcome in many other places in Europe. And the reason for that really was that the Dutch were mainly interested in getting rich off the fur trade, trading for furs with the Indians. Now, you have to understand that in those days they didn't have the kind of synthetic materials that we use today to make coats and jackets and hats. Those items of clothing were typically made from the skins of fur-bearing animals, like beaver, otter, muskrat, and then of course some more expensive varieties, mink, sable, and so forth. And so the Dutch struck up a friendship with the powerful Five Nations of the Iroquois, living in what's now upstate New York, and gave them weapons and money, and in return the Iroquois supplied the Dutch with large numbers of furs so that the Dutch could make a huge profit selling those furs in the European market. And so essentially the Dutch were business people. They didn't really care what religion or what nationality somebody was, as long as they could contribute to the economy. And so they welcomed many different types of people into New Amsterdam and New Netherland. So how did New Netherland become New York, as we call it today? Well, of course, the English still claimed the entire Atlantic coast of North America, or most of it anyway, between present-day Maine and Georgia at this time. And by 1664, the King of England, Charles II, was ready to evict the Dutch from what he saw as his lands and to reclaim them for England. And so he approached his brother James, whose title was the Duke of York. Later he would be known as King James II of England. And he proposed that James go over with some ships and some soldiers and capture New Netherland, and in return he promised to make New Netherland a proprietary colony with the Duke of York as its proprietor. And so that's what James did. And so he sailed into present-day New York harbor and pointed his cannon at New Amsterdam. And immediately, the Dutch in New Amsterdam surrendered to the English without their even having to fire a shot, because they were already a little bit disgruntled with the way they were being treated by the government in the Netherlands. And furthermore, like I said, they really were only interested in making money. They knew the English were also a great commercial nation, and they figured it didn't really matter who ruled over them as long as they could continue to make a killing on the fur trade. And so, without firing a shot, James, the Duke of York, took over New Netherland, and it became an English colony named after him and his title, Duke of York. That's why we call it New York City and New York State today. Now let's talk about Pennsylvania. Okay, that is from the Greek. Pennsylvania means Penn's forest, the forest belonging to Penn. So who was this Penn that owned the forest? Well, he was a very famous Englishman of his time, William Penn. He was an admiral in the English Navy, and so he was a very important military figure. Penn was also a member of a very interesting religious group called the Society of Friends, but usually called the Quakers. Okay. The Society of Friends got that name because its members believed that everybody in the world was absolutely equal in the sight of God. And so they did not believe in social classes. They did not believe in differences of rank or nobility. They treated everyone they met the same, as a friend. And so they were known as the Society of Friends. The Quakers were a very unusual group who were very different from many other groups in the Christian religion. I actually had the chance to go to a Quaker meeting once. I had a friend in college who was a Quaker, and so he took me to a Quaker meeting. It was really fascinating. So everybody, there were no hymns, there was no music, there wasn't even a minister. There were no Bible readings. Basically, everybody just sat around in a circle and waited to receive what Quakers call the inner light. That is, some kind of inspiration from the Holy Spirit of God. And every now and then, someone in the meeting would get the inner light and they would speak what they thought God was telling them to say. And then everyone would sit in silence for a while. And then someone else would get the inner light, and they would say something, and that's what Quaker meetings are like. Furthermore, anybody was allowed to speak in a Quaker meeting, including women, and that was very, very unusual at the time. No Christian denomination had women ministers, women preachers, and in general, women were not even allowed to speak in church at that time, and so for Quakers to allow women to speak in church, that was considered to be very radical. And in fact, it gave rise to a very long-standing tradition of Quaker women preachers and public speakers. In later times, in the 19th century, many Quakers got involved with the anti-slavery movement. And some of the most effective Quaker anti-slavery activists were, in fact, women, as we'll see a little bit later in the course. So that is thanks to the Quaker idea that women too could speak in church. Other things that made the Quakers seem strange to other English people at this time, they refused to swear an oath. Okay, and this is still a custom we have in our society, especially in court. So if you are called to be a witness in a criminal or a civil case, or you are a member of a jury, typically you would be sworn in, and you would have to swear, if you were witness, for example, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. And you would swear on the Bible, right? Now, I think in most states today, you can actually, if you don't believe in God or you're not a Christian, you can just affirm that you're going to do that. But in general, people are still sworn in, and the Quakers refused to do that. Um, it was against their religion to swear an oath, and so that made them seem to be kind of sneaky and untrustworthy. Because after all, if they don't swear to tell the truth in court, well, they must have something to hide after all, you know. And so that made the Quakers seem odd. Also, well, you know, if you think of our typical image of the Quaker, nowadays it comes from the Quaker Oats box. And if you look at that little guy on the cover of the Quaker oatmeal container, you'll see that he's wearing this black hat. All right, and that's actually historically correct because Quaker men would always wear a hat whenever they left their house. In this portrait of William Penn on this page, you see he must have been in his own home when it was made because he's not wearing a hat. But whenever Quaker man went out of the house, he had to wear his hat, and he never took it off. Not even if he was in the presence of the king or queen or some member of the nobility. Now, of course, if you were in the presence of a high and mighty person like that, you were supposed to take off your hat as a sign of respect. Okay, we do this today, for instance, at baseball games when the national anthem is played, or football games. Men will take off their hats as a sign of respect for the nation. Okay, but in English society at that time, you would take off your hat to show respect to a person. The Quakers refused to do that, even if they were in the presence of the king. And that made them seem very unpatriotic and very disrespectful to authority. So that was another reason why the Quakers were persecuted in England. Finally, part of Quaker beliefs is that they are strict pacifists. What does that mean? It means that you do not believe in violence or fighting in a war. And the Quakers retain this belief down to the present day. So if a Quaker is drafted into the military, he has to say that he is a conscientious objector, doesn't believe in fighting, and then he would be assigned to some other role like a medical corps or something like that. Okay, so Quaker pacifism continues down to the present day, and in fact the Quakers took a major part in the anti-war movements of the 60s, also the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. But for all these reasons, like I said, the Quakers were persecuted in English society. People thought they were not trustworthy, not patriotic, and just plain weird. And so William Penn approached King Charles II and asked to create a colony in the New World where he and his fellow Quakers could find peace and religious tolerance and the ability to practice their own religion without being persecuted. And so Charles granted that request and signed off on the Pennsylvania Charter of 1681, yet another written document that was used as the framework for this new proprietary colony of Pennsylvania, with William Penn as the proprietor. And it's interesting, you know, if you read the charter, the Quakers were unusual Christians, but yes, they were still Christians. And so there are strict provisions about things like public drunkenness and adultery and so forth, which were strictly forbidden. In other ways, though, the Pennsylvania Charter was very progressive, you could say. It allowed for nearly complete religious tolerance within the colony. Even Catholics were able to come to Pennsylvania and even to build churches and worship publicly, which was almost unheard of in the English colonies. Also, William Penn really wanted to have good relationships with the Indians in Pennsylvania, and he wanted them to be treated fairly. He didn't want the settlers to exploit them. And so that too is in the charter, that the settlers were not to take land from the Indians without making an agreement with them and without paying for it. And while Penn was alive, Pennsylvania had perhaps the best relationships with the Indians of any of the English colonies. Although, as we'll see in part 2 of this lecture, that relationship would be strained later because of new developments in Pennsylvania. All right, let's talk about some developments in the slave system as it continued to emerge in the South. We've already discussed the cultural difference between the life of slaves in Carolina versus the life of the African Americans in Virginia. We saw that the Carolinas had large plantations. They planned to create a slave system from the very beginning, and so they imported large numbers of Africans almost from the get-go. And so there were more African Americans in the Carolinas. They tended to be more segregated from white people in separate slave quarters, as opposed to Virginia, where the farms, the plantations were somewhat smaller. There was more interaction between blacks and whites in Virginia. And so in Virginia, African Americans tended to be more assimilated to English culture, whereas in Carolina, the slaves were able to maintain more of their Africanness, their African religion, their African language, their African customs. And we also talked about the difference between the work systems in the colonies with the gang system in Virginia and the task system in the Carolinas. Characteristic of both types of slave system, however, was slave resistance. Okay? Now, when we think of slave resistance, we tend to think of large-scale slave rebellions, like the Nat Turner Rebellion that we'll talk about later in the course. And yes, that did happen sometimes, but more typically, resistance was an everyday thing for African Americans who would try to find ways to make their lives more bearable. One form of resistance, very common, was malingering. What is malingering? Malingering is when, nowadays it might take this form, you call your boss and you say, "Oh, I feel really bad, boss. I won't tell you the symptoms because it's too disgusting, but I don't think I can come in today. Goodbye." You know, that's malingering. Basically, when you call in sick and you're not sick. Slaves would malinger quite a bit. So if you had a master who was more reasonable and you could convince the master or the mistress that you were sick, you might get a day or two off from work. Another form of resistance, a little more dramatic, was sabotage. Okay, sabotage could take various forms, everything from the breaking of tools up to the burning of barns. So, you know, a slave might, you know, he might be, his task for the day might be to hoe out part of an indigo field, but if he could go to the overseer and show him that his hoe was broken, he might be able to get off that task for the day. And the overseer would cuss, and he'd probably say how stupid the slave was, etc., etc., whereas in fact that slave was being very clever, and he was finding a way to not be exploited for that particular day for his free labor. Okay, so sabotage was something that also happened very frequently on slave plantations. Also, I want to mention that as it developed, the black church became really the center of slave resistance. Okay, over time, most slaves did become Christians, but their Christianity was a very special type of Christianity. They would build what were called praise houses, typically out in the woods, and African Americans would go out to the praise houses, often in the middle of the night, and they would conduct their own worship services with their own particular customs and practices. For example, African American slaves tended to emphasize certain stories in the Bible, stories that gave them hope, like the story of Moses leading the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt. That became very, very important to these African American slaves. Also, in their worship, we know that the slaves continued certain customs that came directly from African religious rituals, such as shouting. This came from a form of African liturgical dance called the ring shout. All right. And this is very well documented. And so in their praise houses, African Americans could syncretize or combine African religious traditions with the Christian faith that they learned from their European masters and create their own distinctive, unique type of Christianity. And this became very, very important for the black community as time went on. Again, as a source of hope that someday, with God's help, they would be free people. I do want to mention and a very important slave revolt that took place in 1739 in South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion. What triggered this rebellion was the situation in Florida, which I talked about earlier. Remember how King Carlos II of Spain had issued that proclamation inviting slaves from the English territories to come to Florida. If they could make it to Florida, they would be free people, and the men would be enlisted in the Spanish army. Well, that policy had been so successful that in 1738, on the outskirts of St. Augustine, Florida, a fort was created called Fort Mose that was entirely staffed by these African American ex-slaves. And in fact, if you go to St. Augustine today, you can see there is actually a historic site on the site of Fort Mose. It isn't a really terrific site at this point, but it's worth a visit because here you have people that really use their agency to obtain freedom for themselves and their families, and to create this institution, Fort Mose. Well, in South Carolina, there was a group of slaves from Angola, which is now a country in southwestern Africa. These Angolan slaves had already been converted to the Catholic Christian faith when they were still in Angola by Portuguese missionaries. So they were Catholic, and they heard that if they could make it to Florida, to Fort Mose, they could not only be free and help to defend the fort, but they could also practice their Catholic religion, and that was very attractive to them. And so in 1739, a number of these Angolan slaves ran away and tried to make it to Florida. Unfortunately, they did not reach their goal. They were captured, they were executed, and their bodies were tied to stakes on the road to Charleston, South Carolina, to discourage any other slaves from trying to revolt and win their freedom. But the Stono Rebellion, I think, shows that African Americans never lost that drive, that hope for freedom, and sometimes were willing to go to extreme lengths to obtain it. All right, finally, let's talk about a few other colonies that we haven't discussed yet. What about New Jersey? Okay, New Jersey was founded as a proprietary colony in 1664, but it had two proprietors, Lord Berkeley and Lord Carteret, who did not always get along with each other. And so in 1676, New Jersey split into two halves, East and West Jersey, but eventually the two halves were reunited in 1702, creating the colony of New Jersey, now the state of New Jersey. like New York, New Jersey was a place with a lot of diversity, especially religious diversity. In fact, during the First Great Awakening, as we'll talk about in the second half of this lecture, New Jersey would become a real hotbed for that revival type of Christianity that was popular during that religious event. New Hampshire was originally part of Massachusetts, north of Massachusetts, but in 1679 it separated from Massachusetts and became a royal colony. Delaware was originally part of Pennsylvania. It's on the peninsula called the Delmarva Peninsula, which is shared by Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. They're on the east side of the Chesapeake Bay if you look at the map. But the residents of Delaware felt that they were too far away from Philadelphia, the capital of Pennsylvania, to really be represented effectively there, and so they petitioned in 1704 to get their own legislative assembly, and the English crown granted that. That was the first step in the process by which Delaware became a separate English colony. Well, this was a fairly short lecture, but be sure to watch the second half of this lecture, The English Colonies in the 18th Century, Part 2.